So there's a lot of talk about consciousness and awareness when we're reading spiritual pointers and teachings. And I know in my case there was a period when I wasn't really familiar or didn't have a frame of reference as to what this consciousness or awareness or I am was actually referring to. Certain shifts hadn't happened, and so I'd sort of skim over the word, but it was everywhere: consciousness, this, and awareness, and being. I wouldn't skim over. I knew it was there, but I didn't really know what it meant. And one day, it started to present itself in a tangible sense, what awareness is. And that's the point of these teachings, is they're not just meant to be words. If we have a definition of what awareness is, and that's all we have, a definition, then we might mistake the pointers to mean it's pointing to our definition. And so then we keep seeing, which is not really seeing, what is pointed at through our definition, rather than really landing a seeing that is not an intellectual defining, without really landing on what is here right now. And so this consciousness, even though it's formless, can actually become aware of itself as a function, as a functioning. And an example of why this doesn't happen is if I talk about an apple on a table in the corner of the room, and I start describing the apple, and I say it's a red apple and it's shiny and it has a stem with leaves, and on I go. And as I'm describing, I say, but look at the apple for yourself. Really see it. And then I continue to describe the apple. I say it's on a table in the corner of the room, and the table is like this, and it's this corner of the room, the back left corner. But really look at it for yourself. And I continue to describe it, and everyone's really looking at me, interested in my description and thinking about it. And then I'll say to someone, so tell me about the apple. And they'll tell me, oh, it's a red apple and it's shiny and it's got a stem and green leaves. And what if the apple's green? You know? But I'm describing it, and maybe I'm describing it wrong. The point is to look and see the apple for yourself. And sometimes the functioning of our brain, especially the labeling of things, has taken over from an actual seeing what is. You know, we're told what is, and then we see what is through that filter. Sometimes we don't even look to see what is, to check if it still is that. We just say, oh, this is how it is, because I've been told and I trust what I've been told, let's say. And so we don't see what it we just say this is what it is. And when we say this is what it is, we're just repeating a belief. And so when we're told consciousness, what we are is here right now. Always here right now. It's true. It's here. We can see it, we can be it, we can recognize it. When I say we, I'm actually ironically talking about the very consciousness that sometimes we're not familiar with, that does the recognizing of itself. That's how we can start to maybe conceptualize or come to understand intellectually at first, it is here because it is what does the awaring. We might notice that whenever we are aware of anything, the brain very quickly thinks about what we're aware of. It labels it as good or bad, or maybe not even in that judgmental way. It just says, oh, that's a door, it's red. And that happens so automatically that maybe we're not familiar with the fact that the awaring is not done by the brain, that the thinking about what is seen is additional on top of it. It happens so simultaneously to the seeing that sometimes we might think, but if I didn't think about it, I wouldn't know it. So we can start to mistake the awaring for the functioning of the brain, the thinking. And there's a lot of assumptions that have been put in place based on our experience that say, for example, it's the eyes that see. Actually, if you just look, and language doesn't help us here, I'm talking about seeing and looking. I'm not really talking about the seeing and looking of the eyes. It might be an assumption that there are eyes. Like, find your eyes right now. But what's undeniable is that there is awareness or seeing. It's an assumption that the eyes do it. But the experience, an illusion maybe, is set up to create certain correlations in experience that make us convinced that the eyes are seeing. So if we cover the eyes, what is seen changes. It's these beliefs, these assumptions that maybe are not as true as the experience suggests, that when they're dropped, allows something beyond them to show through, something less limited than the beliefs. So some of the beliefs we have that keep us not aware of the present are these. One, that the senses are doing the sensing. Two, that it is the body that is the subject perceiving objects. Three, that there is a here and a there. The belief that, Australia is over there and New York is over there, and there is here, which is the house, and outside there is a garden or a street. Our experience confirms that that is the case, but let's not take experience to be absolutely truth. Just like our experience says it's the eyes that are seeing. But let's not hold on to that as an absolute truth. And right now, is there a street outside? Is there an over there? The belief that there is, of course there's an outside, of course there's an over there. That belief keeps the over there in place, and it creates a here and a there. And quite linked to that belief is the belief that there is time, that there's a past and a future. And that too is a concept in the present moment. It's a belief that says, I lived in the past, I have a memory of the past, and therefore the past exists, or existed. That memory is a object in the present moment, a belief or a concept. If we hold it as just a concept, yes, the memory is there, but let's not turn it into an absolute truth. Let's not assume that the memory means that there absolutely is a past. Now, I'm not going to the extent of saying there is no outside, there is no past. I'm just suggesting that we become really present with what's here and use that as our evidence rather than relying on assumptions that can't be confirmed with evidence right now. Another belief that keeps us from the present is the belief that everything happens because of cause and effect. Also something that our experience confirms, but something which we also can hold as a concept and not necessarily absolutely true. So the opposing notion to the belief we have that everything happens because A leads to B leads to C is the concept that cause and effect is an illusion, that the experience is designed to appear as if A leads to B leads to C, but that maybe the experience is a spontaneous arising that arises right now, includes in it memories that suggest there was a past. Take, for example, that this moment has arisen for the first time, the experience of a body is here, and that you've never lived before. That you don't actually have a history. But in this spontaneous arising right now, a whole history is included in the form of memory to create the impression that there is a past. So once again, this set of pointers now is specifically to help us become really present with what is right now. Maybe so much so that awareness will become aware of itself, something that has always been here, something so subtle in a way that even though it's always been here, hasn't been recognized. And the final belief that keeps us from being really present, so much so that awareness can become aware of itself, is that there is a God, and that there is consciousness everywhere, that everything is conscious, and that there is a God aware of the whole universe, and that other humans have consciousness. This is an assumption. What we know is our consciousness. If we're really present and we treat this moment as an experience, the experience includes seemingly separate objects in it. And what we call the other is an object in our perception, an object in the experience. And once again, our belief superimposes onto the present moment something that is not able to be confirmed, that the other has consciousness. If a robot was placed in a seat and the robot was aesthetically designed in such a way that it looked like a human, and it would talk back to you, answer your questions, our projection onto the robot would be that the robot has consciousness. Unless we realize, I can't confirm this. The robot is an object in my perception. I'm not suggesting that we live life like this. This is an exercise to bring us into the present moment by questioning our beliefs that are not normally seen to be beliefs and may well be obstacles to presence. What is undeniable is your own consciousness, your own awareness of the present moment. What you might notice is that if the idea that I am a body perceiving an objective reality falls away, and we just realize the awareness that is here of the present moment as an experience, a multi-sensory experience, we could say, including thoughts and feelings. There might be the recognition that the body is just an object, like all the other objects in the experience. And that the awareness is aware not only of objects we would normally call external to the body, but the awareness is aware of the body also as an object. So if you have your eyes open, you might like to soften your gaze so that the whole of the visual experience fits into your field of awareness. Meaning, no need to focus on anything in particular. Allowing your peripheral vision to include as much as it includes, and effectively seeing a complete vista. So with a soft gaze, allowing everything to be as it is, and maybe being aware that thinking is not so required for awareness of what is to happen. you might find that the center of consciousness, which so often resides and is centered in what feels like our head, with this open gaze allowing everything to be as it is, may start to gravitate down towards the center of your chest. That's because the home of consciousness is the heart. So you might visualize this center of awareness or center of consciousness dropping out of your head into your chest area. And maybe notice that it's not even that centralized in your chest. What is undeniable is that there is awareness of this experience. And even the distant sounds, what we call distant sounds, are inside this field of awareness. Nothing is outside. If you have your eyes closed, you might drop the idea that you're looking at the back of your eyelids and realize that there is a vast empty space, formless, with no boundaries, no edges, a space in which all objects of perception arise and fall. Sound comes out of that space and then subsides back into that space. We might find that there is a residual self-image that still exists, a belief that I'm sitting in a chair, in a room, whereas if you become aware of that vast open space, be really present with the experience itself. Where is the room? And where is the body? There may be a sensation in that space of touch, what we call the sensation of touch. A belief might exist that it is our thighs touching the chair. That is a concept superimposing itself over a sense of touch that has very little definition to it. What we'll also find that is undeniable is the sense of existence. So whether you have your eyes open or closed, one thing that is undeniable is the awareness of the present moment experience. The awareness of all of the objects. The objects come and go. The present moment experience is in constant flux. If what we call closing your eyes happens, the whole visual experience, the whole momentary experience changes radically. And if you were then to open your eyes, the visual experience, the momentary experience, once again changes radically. And without needing to open or close your eyes, it's our experience that the momentary experience is continually changing, never staying constant. But what is undeniable is the awareness of that ever-changing experience and the sense of existence. What exists is not demonstrated, but the undeniable sense that there is existence. I am. Not I as the body, but if I pose the question, are you dead? You don't need to think about it. The experience itself confirms I am, I exist, or existence. The I in this context is not referring to a personalness. It's referring to the impersonal sense of existence. That when the body is not particularly present, when thinking that says I am this or that is not particularly active, the conditioned component or aspect falls away. That conditioned component is always changing. The unconditioned I, or sense of existence, is never absent. And the function of awareness, the awareing factor, is never absent. If thinking is happening, we might notice that there is the awareness of the thinking. That which is aware of the thoughts which come and go remains unchanging and ever present. What you are, in essence, is unchanging and ever present. What you are is not a product of the body. The body arises inside what you are. You are not something that walks through the world, but rather the world arises inside what you are. Our identification with objects prevents the recognition of the subject. And it is the subject itself that recognizes the subject. That which is aware can become aware of itself as awareness. Remembering not to assume that there is consciousness anywhere else other than the consciousness that you can confirm for yourself. The awareness that you can confirm for yourself. The awareness you know is your awareness that recognizes each moment. Life is an experience that has only ever arisen in the present moment. If we drop the idea of an inside and an outside, we might find that everything arises inside what I am. thinking is allowed to come and go. Just allow everything to be as it is. That which you are is not affected by what comes and goes, not touched by the content. Awareness and the sense of existence doesn't think about what is present, and yet thinking can happen and be there as an object arising in that awareness. Emotions can be there as objects and content in the awareness. Awareness doesn't judge what arises. The function of awareness is to witness. Maybe there is the recognition that awareness is at no distance from the objects that arise, that the awareness pervades all the objects that arise, that the objects are actually not separate from awareness, made of awareness, recognized by awareness, arising in awareness. a grounding into being this, starts to demonstrate what it is that the human being is at their core. That functions through the body, that which functions through the body as a vehicle, is this formless awareness with the undeniable sense of existence ever present, an awareness that is not affected by what happens in the flow of life, an awareness that doesn't require love from the other in order to be complete. An awareness which in and of itself is self-contenting, peaceful, silent, regardless of the thinking and the circumstance that may be happening. This awareness is not all that we are as human beings. The human being includes the very unique characteristics that the body vehicle contribute to the experience. But to the extent that we only know the characteristics, the biological component, and are unfamiliar with the essence, the core of who we are, life will remain threatening and fearful. Life will seem to be an attack on who I am. And to the extent that there is a grounding, a being, a knowing that what I am at my core is something formless, something ever-present, something unchanging, something self-contenting and at peace with whatever is. Unless that grounding is there, or if that grounding is there, then life is able to continue to unfold moment after moment as it's destined to unfold, not in our control. And being connected to this ever-present formless awareness, knowing that that is the core of who I am, life ceases to be a threat on who I am at my core. And even physical death is then seen to be part of the unfolding experience, the ending of a particular type of experience which is always changing, experience which comes and goes. And physical death is no longer an attack on who I believe myself to be, because that formless awareness that is ever present, even prior to the experience, is not attacked by the death of the body. Our happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. Our happiness is not to be found in whether there is pleasure or pain in the flow of life. The flow of life is the content. Our happiness stems from this essence of who we are. So when you like, if your eyes are closed, feel free to open them. So during the day, one way that we can drop into this being on a regular, consistent basis, without necessarily having to sit for an extended period of time, is to remember that when awareness lands on thinking, primarily the thinking which is described as one of the 5 forms of suffering in this teaching, whenever awareness lands on guilt or blame, pride, worry, anxiety, expectation, or attachment to outcome, the thought, I am, might arise. The thought, I am, might arise because life has started to demonstrate the essence of who we are, started to highlight that regardless of circumstance, I am, and what I am exists in a dimension outside of thought, felt not in the head but in the heart. And so the thought I am effectively bookends the thinking that's happening at that point in time, and effectively cuts it off, allowing us to drop into the heart of being, where we find ourselves again. And at first we might find ourselves dropping into the heart, and before we know it, we're back in the head again, thinking about blame and guilt. And it might even be 10 or 15 minutes before there is the awareness that awareness has been pulled out of the heart and back into the head. This is very natural and normal. Natural, maybe not so. Normal, yes. When awareness lands on the fact that, oh, I'm thinking again, the thought, I am, might arise, cutting off the thinking, effectively being the final thought before we drop back into the heart, where we can be. And once again, after 10 or 15 minutes, we might notice the thinking has happened. We were only there for a second, only in being for a second. And this is not a tragedy. It's an opportunity to drop back into being. So I am can arise many times during the day, as you're working, as you're playing, as you're driving. It doesn't require the activity to stop. And as we find ourselves dropping into the heart more and more regularly, maybe only for a second at a time, 20 times a day, and then within a day or two or a week we find that we can rest in being for 2 seconds before getting pulled out into thinking. That's a significant step to returning home. And within weeks we might find ourselves resting in being for minutes at a time. So this isn't a practice This is the spontaneous arising of a thought, I am, which is a reminder that where I really exist is not in the field of thinking, but in the field of being. A reminder that the thinking, which has been recognized to be obsessive thinking in the moment, actually serves very little positive purpose other than to create a particular experience, which we call suffering. That the blame for the other, for what they have done in the past, is not delivering what we previously thought it was, is not as beneficial as we thought it was. So the thought I am is a reminder that cuts off the thinking and allows us to drop into being. And at some point we might find ourselves resting in the heart. The old habit has weakened sufficiently that it becomes obvious that our heart is the home, and that the movement away from the heart is something that has become normal but is not natural. We might find that we can actually live our whole life doing what needs to be done in each moment, functioning on a biological level, and not losing a connection with our ground of being. A simultaneous inward and outward attention. And in recognizing our being, resting there, it might become apparent that this being, this awareness, this existence, is not something that stems from the body, but rather is an extension of the one impersonal source that has linked and identified with a particular body and is functioning through that body as personal consciousness, experiencing the world, life as it is right now, experiencing the flow of life as it's destined to be experienced, experiencing life as it's been created in this moment, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, and maybe even noticing that the awareness of the present moment is the awareness of God or Source functioning through this particular body and all other bodies, aware of the creation from that particular perspective. That the awareness flowing through your eyes is actually the awareness of Source, and that Source is not experiencing this moment from out there through some CCTV system, but actually experiencing life as you. Source only ever experiences life through you. This is what is meant by you are God. God is not out there. You and God are not two. When I talk about you and God are not two, or that I am God, I'm not talking about me being God in some omnipresent form, other than the omnipresence of this moment. This moment is the whole universe. The idea that the universe is any bigger than this is a concept. But I'm not suggesting that we are God in any creative capacity. But what we can be aware of right now is the awareness, the function to witness, the function of witnessing, and the undeniable sense of existence. Those are the two aspects of God that we are in this moment. And with this perspective, hatred for the other falls away, hatred for oneself falls away, and that is the seed of love, which is a power that pervades the whole universe. So if anyone has anything that they want to share or comment on or question, feel free. Yeah.
I feel like I'm going to get emotional again. And it's not sadness. I just feel like overwhelmed sometimes with like love, I guess, and I can't hold it. Like if when I'm watching satsang sometimes, and I hear the teacher saying something, and it feels like something is just falling over me. And I don't know, I guess the best way I can explain it is maybe I feel what I believe is, just God's love. And like when you were saying this awareness, and like as a child, I remember, I think I was like maybe 12, and I went inside my bathroom and I looked at myself in the mirror, and I saw this face looking back at me. I mean, I recognized it as me, and I mean, as a child you don't really understand, but and I thought to I asked myself, like, who are you? Who are you? And as a child I thought, you're, Adriana, what do you mean? Who are you? And then almost instantly I recognized that that was just a label. I'm sure there are many people named Adriana, and I didn't say label, but that's how I thought about it. And so right away I started, my mind started searching, like, okay, if you're not that, what are you? And I just put it to, it kind of frightened me, the fact that I couldn't figure out what I really was. I just put it to the back of my mind. But that kind of set me on a search, trying to figure out what this, but yeah, like I've always felt a sense of existence, you know. And for me, you say how we search for happiness, and more than happiness, I want to find that peace of mind. And even more than that, I think, is I want to feel that connection with God. And it's not so much, like you say, it's the doer searching for love from the other. It feels like it's deeper than that. Because that's more like a needy or romantic. And I have, I have the love of my children. I have the love of my parents. I have the love of, a man, romantic love, but it's more than that. I really want to feel that connection with, I don't know, source, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when at the time when I do feel that, it overwhelms me.
Mm-hmm.
And like I can't hold it in this body. It just overflows. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to comment on that.
Very nice. If I can add or elaborate on that, and as to how it fits into so much of what we've been talking about. And not only what we've been talking about here, but some of the profound non-dual teachings, Advaita teachings, revolves around the question, who am I? Or, so Ramana Maharshi's self-inquiry revolves around the question, who am I? And Nisargadatta's teaching revolves around, I am. And what I like so much about that is that you can put Ramana's teaching the question, who am I? And Nisargadatta's core of his teaching, I am, together. And I am is the answer to who am I. Not the words I am, not the thought I am, but just the being. And in being, the question, who am I, falls away. So when you point out that as a child you looked in the mirror and saw the physical and somehow knew, yes, but this is not who I am, it could be because when we lose ourselves in a good way, lose ourselves in activity, just gardening or painting or walking, playing, we're not aware so much of the physical. And yet there is this undeniable existence. We don't suddenly feel like, where have I gone? When we're not focused on the physical and we're lost in a good way in an activity, there is a sense of presence. Not that we might not be aware of it, because it's so natural. It's just who we are. And there's been times, especially when this understanding has been in place in a grounded way, that the awareness of the body is very minimal. And I remember one time being on a bus and then looking to the left and seeing a reflection in the window, and I thought it was someone else, and then I had to do a double take. Oh, that's me. Because as we ground into our being, then that's who we know ourselves as. And so as a child, maybe this wasn't consciously recognized. So what's there is that we know I am, but then when we see a physical aspect, we go, but that's not me. But then the question arises, who am I then? Because awareness hasn't necessarily landed on this formless sense of existence. And so humans have this intellect that is developed enough such that it can be problematic or very beneficial. The human instrument is the only instrument with an intellect developed enough to conceptualize its own existence. Animals, as far as we can tell based on tests and experiments, don't have an intellect that is sufficient to conceptualize their own existence. Now, this means, Ramesh used to call it the dubious gift of the intellect, because this intellect can and does, when it conceptualizes its own existence, turn into all of the suffering. Why did this happen to me? You should do this and you shouldn't do that. I should do this. And so a whole lot of thinking that an animal doesn't have. An animal will biologically move away from someone who is known to maltreat them. That's a biological movement. But they don't have an intellect that has conceptualized their own existence, and so they don't sit there thinking about this person when they're not present, saying, why does he do this to me? He shouldn't do this to me. But an animal doesn't have an intellect that can recognize its own existence either. And so this gift of self-realization is not something available to an animal. And in a child, the sense of I is there, but maybe the honed intellect in conjunction with awareness hasn't really become aware of what I am at my core. And so the question arises, who am I? And the quest, the search can start. It's a beautiful search because it's a search that is stemming from the intuitive knowing of who we are. And then we need to be able to understand who we are on a fuller level.
What is the difference between who am I and what am I?
It's, at the end of the day, it becomes pedantics in terms of words, but as a pointer at first, it's important in a way to differentiate between who am I and what am I, because our standard definition of the word who implies a person, more so, and changing the word who am I to what am I can loosen our expectation of what to find, or loosen our expectation of who I am as a person, maybe. Because the question, who am I, is really pointing to the essence of the human being, so that that can be known. It's not necessarily that the essence is the complete human being, but it's the aspect of the human being that has not been recognized. Very significant, the core, the backbone of the human experience. That because it's ever present and so subtle compared to the gross objects that arise, it's missed. And so the spiritual teachings understand that this is the core problem that humanity is faced with, a disconnection from the core of who the human is, or what the human is. So this teaching is put forward, this who am I question, and what am I can become a more useful question at some point. Because what we land on is not particularly a who, it's not a person with personality and characteristics, but this formless essence. And I say this because I remember at some point I would write what am I instead of who am I. It seemed much more appropriate. I would write it when I was, let's say, responding to questions and stuff like that. And now it sort of seems like who am I is more appropriate, because the understanding of what we are at our core then gets integrated back into a recognition of what we are as a human being. And so then the word who am I, refers to who am I as Roger. And so I know Roger to be the impersonal consciousness of Source linked to a particular body functioning through the body as personal consciousness. So the whole package to me is now Roger, known more than it used to be. So Roger used to be assumed to be a separate, independent biological entity. Now, my understanding of Roger is different, because that essence has been recognized. And so now, once that becomes integrated back in, so that Roger is understood on a more holistic level, then I like the who am I. So really, at the end, it becomes pedantics. who am I or what am I, but at different parts of the seeing, the exploration. I would suggest what am I is a better pointer.
Could you speak a little bit about self-image as a hindrance to recognizing what am I?
So self-image, as I use the term, refers to a belief about who I am, an idea about who I am. And in this teaching, the self-image that is pointed at is the belief that I am the doer as a separate entity that orchestrates everything that happens through me as my doing. And that's the identity that is pointed at, the self-image. And contained in that is the belief that I require life to look a certain way, to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure primarily, in order to be complete. So that becomes my self-image, my belief of myself, which is a belief that runs in the head on a very deeply ingrained level, and it runs continuously as it sees life. So we have a self-image that says I need life to be a certain way, and that I am the doer, and so it is continually functioning throughout the day, which means that awareness is forced to be aware of obsessive thinking. And so while the self-image is in place, a recognition of what we truly are, prior to thought, prior to belief, doesn't get a chance to be on center stage. And so once the self-image is recognized by the intellect actually starts to recognize, wow, I have this self-image, this belief about myself, and that the flow of life is continually bumping into my self-image. And when my self-image is bumped into by the flow of life, what happens is these mini explosions of suffering.
So, as an example, could the self-image be like in the meditation, an arising of a picture of this person and their story and their desires and their needs and the attachment to things being a certain way, or the desire, which I guess you call expectation, and then attaching, hoping that works out, and then the self-image will be happy?
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what the self-image is.
And so then if the self-image fell away, then there wouldn't be that expectation, or would the expectation fall away first and the attachment to something? How does that work?
The self-image is the set of beliefs. So, and the set of beliefs includes my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. You can see that it's my happiness is to be found. So the my is, that's why it's a self-image. By having that belief of my happiness, it is intrinsically part of the self-image. And I am the doer, meaning I am a separate independent entity in control of everything that I do. So this becomes the idea of who I am. And what's being pointed at is that what we are is very different in actuality to this belief system we have about ourselves. And so it's our belief system about ourselves, our self-image, which is inaccurate, that effectively it's an error, and life impacts that image, this identity, And as it impacts it, there's all this suffering that happens. And so we can see that if the self-image is, I am inferior, I am not worthy, or I need this in order to be complete, or I am better than someone else.
And that's a thought or a belief that this particular person has latched onto, whatever that may be, many flavors. But it may be, I need X to be complete. And that's just a belief that's been latched onto, and the basis of it is believing that there's this person in the world with a story who needs that. And even if in this particular case, the belief that I'm not the doer may have been seen through, I'm not the doer, but then there might be still the other belief, which is, you're not the doer, but you still want life to turn out a certain way to be happy. And so you're waiting for life to turn out a certain way to be happy.
You actually mean the belief I am the doer has been seen through.
Exactly.
Not I'm not the doer.
Yeah.
That's right. And so to the extent that the doership starts to fall away, that means a part of the self-image is crumbling. To the extent that the other part that says, okay, I might not be the doer, but I need things to be this way and this way and this way, then another part of the self-image, a very significant part of the self-image, remains in place.
And how does that dissolve?
Ideally, well, in practical terms, it seems to dissolve when an awareness that belief is never going to be fulfilled, because the flow of life is never pleasure, 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 pleasure.
Or could it be that an awareness that the belief that I need X to be complete is never going to be fulfilled, because sometimes life will deliver X and sometimes not, or that life would never deliver X, and making peace with that, whatever X is.
Yeah, basically knowing that
because you can't
X
control
is
what life
not in our
delivers.
control. That's right.
Yeah.
But furthermore, the more significant insight, because if we see that life is not in control, that we're not in control of life, that doesn't necessarily prove that I don't need life to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order to be complete. What it means is that I can't control life. Right?
Yeah, I still may want, in this case, love or, a house or whatever it may be, X. And if I don't see that love is not going to complete me, then I'm still trapped.
Yeah, and so how we come to see that is by receiving it from time to time, what we desire, realizing that when we get what we desire, at best it's pleasure, and that it's short-lived, and that it doesn't deliver completeness. And so as we see this more and more often, it might become clear, my idea that love will complete me, that pleasure will complete me, is out of line with my own experience. So as we become aware of the experience, that we get what we want sometimes.
But do you need to experience that to know it? Do I need to receive love to know that it won't be fulfilling?
It's very helpful for those people that have the belief and never have the evidence that suggests otherwise. It makes sense that they will be forced to continue to seek that which they haven't experienced, because they don't have the evidence that it won't deliver what they think it will. Having said that, that sounds like bad news for someone who's never been... So it's not at all the only way. The other way of confirming it is to find ourselves resting in being, meaning dropping into being, which is a place where we become connected with our true essence, a bit like the meditation. Hopefully some of us dropped into this place where there was a recognition of the formless self and dropping out of thinking. And if that dropping into being can happen simultaneous to life being painful, meaning that pain comes and we find ourselves suffering, and then a reminder, oh, I am. And we drop into being, and it becomes apparent, oh, the pain is not actually the cause of my suffering. The pain is pain in the moment. My suffering is the attitude to the pain. So when we drop into being, what happens is our attitude changes. The attitude of attachment is cut off. We drop into being, and there is the attitude of the heart. And we find that when the attitude of the heart is functioning, there is peace, even in the face of pain. So we then, from our own experience, see, oh, I can be at peace, even when there is pain present. Which means my happiness is not to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. We have first-hand experience that I can be happy, and remembering happy in this context means peace of mind. Right? This is the definition of happiness for the human being.
But it doesn't take the pain away.
No, but when we rest in being and are at peace, pain is just pain, which is significantly more acceptable. In fact, can be totally acceptable, even though it's painful.
I don't have a problem accepting pain in my life. I've got good practice, and I don't have a problem with that. I was just trying to understand these nuances. It's really helpful. Thank you.
Considering aspects of what I heard Brandon's question to be last night, there's something lingering about a longing. So that experience of openness, that's kind of nothing, not a thing. Although within that, as a person, there may be experience of aliveness, vibrationally. But there are those peak experiences, for instance, love that's just of this magnitude. And it seems then that there's some kind of an intimacy happening with all that is. So, like what I said to Brandon last night, is that all there is? This nothing, to be at peace with that, and to be at peace with the longing, maybe. Can you? I don't know. I'm even being
No, yeah, the question's very clear. So, one of the forms of suffering, one of the biggest forms of suffering, is expectation, attachment to outcome. And that is the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure. And love is pleasure. Love is beautiful pleasure. So reducing all of the flow of life down to pleasure and pain doesn't actually reduce pleasure and pain to something different to what it is. So the range of pleasure and pain in life is vast, and love is one of these experiences in the flow of life that is pleasure and can be extremely beautiful. So we're not reducing the beauty of love down here, but we're categorizing it in such a way that might allow our intellect to start relating to it in a healthy way. So it doesn't change love from being a beautiful pleasure. But what it's saying is that beautiful pleasure, although it has the effect of cutting off our suffering when it's present, is never going to be our ongoing happiness. But because it's the best we know sometimes, pleasure or pain is what we tend to know, because it's part of the gross experience, and the subtle experience is not necessarily that grounded into, then it makes sense that the assumption based on our own experience is pleasure is better than pain. Sometimes when I get pleasure, I feel content for the time when I have pleasure. And so then the assumption is, well, I guess I need life to be continuous pleasure. And love being a more ephemeral pleasure than some of the more objective pleasures, like food, or maybe we think, okay, but love is maybe something that could be there all the time. And so this error that my happiness is to be found in love gets put in place. The broader error is my happiness is to be found in pleasure, because that's the best that we have. And why we tend to assume that our happiness is to be found in love is because when we look at the core root of this belief in doership, the identity, the self-image, at its root we'll find shame. And why shame is the root is because in this creation, this story of life, this creation, a human condition, we could call it, has been put in place as a standard, like a general rule. And that human condition is what maybe is referred to as original sin in some religions, but I don't at all relate to it in the way that the religions relate to it, but we can start to see a similarity. So sin in Latin means error. So original sin really means original error. And it seems to me that in this creation of life, when the human being is born, it comes into the world with an original error. And that error is, I am not good enough. I have been kicked out because I'm not good enough. And that life maybe is a metaphor of, or maybe metaphor is not the right word, is that if we have some frame of reference that source is absolute nothing, formless, the unmanifest, that's source at rest, the most basic. And life is the manifest. So that's source in its expressing form. And so ultimately, source is always going to return back to the unmanifest, its home. And so maybe the process of manifesting, especially this particular universe of time and space and duality, because this is the only one I've observed to come up with this thing of original sin, right, is that it feels like when consciousness arises in this form, in an incarnate form, it feels like it's been thrown out of the unmanifest. And so, and another sort of mirror down version of this is when we're actually born as human beings, we're maybe thrown out of the mother and that cord cut. And so, like the baby might have found, this is my home, the womb is my home, I'm safe, I'm comfortable, I'm connected to my source. And then something happens, the birthing process happens, and I'm thrown out of my home. And so that might help to show the source at rest in its unmanifest, and then it becomes source in movement, the manifest, and we appear as this physical, and maybe there's something deep down that says, hey, what happened? I was formless, and now I'm in form. And the belief that's included in that. So this is really, it's all a story, right? But it's not just a story. Somehow life has informed this story. I'm not saying it's absolute truth, but it's what I've observed in my own experience and in many others as they describe the identity at the root, shame, is evident. So if that's the original sin, meaning the original error that the human holds, that I'm not good enough, I've been thrown out. I have been thrown out because I did something wrong, and being thrown out means I no longer have love of the source or my parent. Then it makes sense that that error is going to inform us of the solution. And the solution is, well, I was thrown out, I no longer have the love that I had that made me feel complete, so I need love. That's what the error informs us that the solution is. But if an error informs us of a solution, there's a very good chance that the solution it's telling us that we need is an error. And that's what we come to see, is that, what I am was never thrown out, was never a failure, was never not good enough. That's the story that is projected onto a very impersonal happening. Just like if there are a bunch of kids in a foster home, and then the foster home runs out of money and gets closed down, and the kids are sent somewhere else, or a house, let's say a family, and something happens in the family, and the kids, they might create a story. I wasn't good enough, and this is why I was sent somewhere else, which may actually not be the real reason. It could be a totally impersonal reason, but the story can be anything. And if it's a wrong story, and if it's a wrong story about who I am, then it makes sense that the self-image is put in place. So deep down, we believe that the answer is love and pleasure. And that might not be accurate. But when we think about it, it's like, that's so nice to think I'm going to be loved, because we crave it, because we feel like we're missing it. We feel like that's what has been taken away from us. And that's the self-image that has all of this belief. If we drop below the self-image, we find something very different there. We find that the suffering is not there, because below the self-image, all that thinking is cut off. It's only when we're identified with the self-image, not recognizing it as self-image, because self-image is in place because it's believed to be truth. So it's a story, a concept that has been turned into truth. This is what it is. This is who I am. This is what I need. I need it because I'm not good enough, and if I get it, it would mean I am good enough. And so it's believed as truth. And we're craving it, essentially. It's almost like someone who believes they need water, but actually doesn't. But the more that they believe it, and the more they think it's missing, the more in search of it they'll be. And when they imagine it, they think, this is going to solve everything. And if they get it, it's like, I got it. And then they realize, I don't need it. Let's say, or it's not what I'm missing. So when the mind that has this attachment hears what is delivered in this process is actually nothing. The mind says, You're kidding me, right? No, it can't be. I'll go and listen to some other teaching that tells me that it's all about love. That's much nicer. And maybe that's why some teachings use the word love, because people actually will go for it and will hang around long enough to start hearing the deeper message that is pointing to maybe love in a different form than the mind is looking for. And so I'm quite happy to say that what we are at our core, or what happiness is love, but I'll have to define that love really to me means the absence of hate, not the presence of some feeling. And in that case, then it starts tying in. It's like, why would I call it love if specifically it's the absence of hate? And hate refers to all of the uncomfortableness, including that original error. The original error is self-hate, the belief I'm not good enough, that I'm a failure, which is all part of the false story that life put in place. So the baby, or when the baby was born, or when the unmanifest became the manifest, that's not a belief that was put in place by the individual. It's a belief that's been put in place by the story, right? So this isn't something that we should feel guilty about having, this original sin, this original error. We didn't put it there. It was meant to be put there in order for this experience of life to be exactly what it is. And so it's a story of forgetting ourselves. We forget ourselves because this error is put in place. An error that says, I am something else. So that is the divine hypnosis that is put in place in order for us to forget who we are. And then the story of life unfolds in such a way that at some point the process starts a process of reminding us, which is really a dissolving of the original error. Until such time as the error is dissolved, a recognition of what we truly are is there by default, because the veil, the hypnosis is no longer there. And then there is this self-contentedness that stems from a groundedness, a connection to source, we could say, meaning a connection to myself. And what we find in practice, as Brandon described yesterday, which is what the teaching goes to extreme lengths to point at, is that in practice, once all of the errors have fallen away, once the self-image has fallen away, we find, what I was really looking for, which has now been delivered, right, is not an addition, but it's the peace that is there as a result of who I am. So a piece of my own being, my own nature. And in practice, it isn't love in a feeling sense. It's the simple allowance of everything to be as it is, allowance of the other to be as they are, the allowance of the other to act exactly as they are destined to act. And then we even say, it's not even about destiny anymore, it's just the other acting the way they act. Delivering pain to me at times, allowance of myself to act. The body doesn't become some super intelligent entity that is, it doesn't become a saint. It will still, open the door, walk out and do something that someone else out there might not want. Inadvertently maybe, but still, even inadvertently to the other person, I'm still delivering pain to the other. And that's not my intention, but if it happens, there is an allowance for the fact that that's how it unfolded. And even if it happened in a way where I knew I had two options, to choose A or B, B is what I want, and A is what the other wants. And I happen to know that if I choose B, that's what the other doesn't want. And biologically, this transformation doesn't mean I'm now going to always choose A, always choose what the other wants. So at times, biologically, I'll say, yeah, I'm choosing B. And there's an allowance for that to happen, even though in hindsight, it delivers pain to the other. And all of that can happen, and there is a peace available, a peace that comes from our true nature, even in the face of life unfolding exactly as it unfolds. And that means no hatred towards the other, no hatred towards oneself, no hatred towards God, for life being the way it is, which is love in its basic form. Love is acceptance, which is the absence of hatred. And then from that ground of being which can be continuous and unbroken because it's our very nature, what can flower is much more complex expressions of love, which can be spontaneous feelings of love for the universe, love towards the other. It can be love for your child or your family or your lover, which is a love that can be felt. A love which is additional to that basic peace. But whether that additional pleasure or pain comes is inconsequential. What's most important, and not even important, what is self-contenting is the peace. Self-contenting means this in itself, including life being the way it is, pleasure or pain, is enough. It's not even saying it's enough, it's saying I find I have no problem with life. And so it means I have no desire for life to look a certain way, including I have no desire for there to be this feeling of love. And yet, not having a desire for life to look a certain way doesn't mean that life isn't going to look a certain way. Life is always going to look one way, however it's created. And so with no desire, the next moment, there could be intense love in the moment. And when it fades away, as the flow of life tends to do, it's not a disaster, because what's left is that underlying peace that is okay with life as it is. So the love gets to be experienced, enjoyed, for as long as it's there. And inevitably the life and the content of life, the flow of life will always change. And that turns out in practice. What I mean by in practice is when it's delivered, we find, I want nothing more than this, and the seeking stops. So when the seeking stops, we can conclude the purpose of life must have been fulfilled, because the seeking has stopped. That implies that the goal has been fulfilled. To the extent that the goal isn't fulfilled, or the purpose of life isn't fulfilled, then seeking will automatically be there, because there's an intuitive knowing what the purpose of life is. And so if our seeking stops, we can then look and see what is it that's here that has brought about the end of seeking. And then we can conclude, that is it. That's the purpose of life. And it just turns out to be that the only time seeking stops on a continuous, unbroken basis is when there is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. And so that's why this teaching says, what are we really looking for, whether we know it or not, is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. So it starts off by calling it happiness, because it is happiness. But happiness, as we have tended to define it, is happiness through pleasure, and ultimately happiness through love. So that's what we are looking for, mistakenly. And it says, actually, in practice, whether we realize it or not, what we're looking for is happiness, but happiness is not to be found in love or in pleasure, but in peace of mind.
I remember as a child, I was 7 years old, seeing an advertisement, a picture of a woman holding a picture of herself, and I had that recognition. And then, since then, dreams and amazing experiences and these, completely unbidden, just that sense of connection that I'm calling love.
Mm-hmm.
But that's an experience. And so if that's what I'm craving, then that's the mistake.
It's a mistake. What is important also to bear in mind is that, and it may link into what you were saying there, is that it's liberation has been described as bliss in teachings, Satchitananda. So existence being bliss, meaning so Satchitananda is like a progression, underlying existence, being human, let's say, or recognizing self-recognition, and the outcome, in a sense, bliss. And Ramesh used to say, there is a great shame happened, which was destined to happen in order for life to unfold as it is, for this to be translated as for Ananda to be translated as bliss, because it creates the expectation that liberation is going to give me continuous bliss. And along the way, there's no doubt, many people experience it, I've experienced it, that there are moments and peak experiences filled with bliss. And so as soon as bliss arises, and the definition has been Satchitananda, which has been translated as bliss, we say, this is it. This is what it's going to be. And why would it be translated as bliss? It might be translated as bliss because at a certain point in the process, the contrast between one and the other is experienced in a way as though it feels like an addition, something gained. So you can imagine if you have a very strong headache, that's pain. And we might be able to equate, well, let's just look at the headache pain. And then if it suddenly stops, it's like, this is bliss. It's actually the normal state. But relative to the intense pain, it's like, this is bliss. As that normal extends in time and the contrast falls away, then we'd stop necessarily describing it as bliss. And so sometimes when we come in contact with the stillness or the silence, it can be overwhelming because of the contrast between it not being there and then it being there. And so that's also something to bear in mind, because it's a phenomena that I see happening, is that as new things come in, even insights come in, it's a bit like getting a new car. You get a new car and it's really exciting for a little while, let's say. You might even, anyway, and then after a while it's like, it's my car, it's normal. And so in this process, which is a process of revelation as a result of things falling away, that reveal what has always been there, it can feel amazing in the process. And then it teaches that don't get too concerned about all of that. That's just experience. and it tends to become much more normal. And when the process becomes stabilized, we can look back and go, wow, it's funny, there were all of this stuff happening, and it was, and in fact the stuff being profound peak experiences can be happening that are revealing a lot about the underlying nature of life. And many books are written about, people in those phases are writing books. Look, this is what... And so sometimes we read the books that describe this part of the process. And of course, we can start to get a little expectation in place about what enlightenment looks like. And maybe those books were written from a place of, not even full understanding because of the very nature of what was happening at that time. And Ramesh had a follower, disciple, whatever, devotee, at one point, who couldn't agree with Ramesh that it's just peace. It's the simple absence of suffering, because he was experiencing all of these different states and experiences, and he actually wrote a book, right, about enlightenment. And it's very poetic because it's talking about seeing everything fresh and that side of it. And in fact, in the book there is a sort of chapter that explains the difference between the difference of opinions between Ramesh and himself. And I could have taken the same stance at some time as this person who wrote the book. I'm just really glad that I never put it in print. Because what I found is that my mind changed as my experience changed, as I started to, as the concepts that Ramesh delivered started to wash away the expectations and recognize those things that were just temporary and would come and go, states and experiences, beautiful and profound ones, mind you, but truly. And I started to realize, the lowest common denominator that is something that is always going to be there and available is the simple peace, which is nothing, right? Nothing additional. All the additional stuff is always coming and going. And it makes sense. Imagine if you had bliss, the best bliss that you've ever experienced. And imagine if it stayed there for 3 weeks. Either it would burn you out, you'd be dead, the body couldn't handle it, or you'd be a vegetable in a sense, because you can't function in life under that intense bliss. Or the worst of the three positive propositions is that it becomes normal. That actual state of heightened bliss would become normal for you, and you then seek an even higher bliss, right? So, So thank you for your explanation yesterday, Brandon. Good. And it took me a while to realize what you meant by it's the same. I was trying to figure out what the same. And then at the end I realized what you're saying is that more or less the experience is that I function as Roger or as Brandon, more or less the way I was functioning before, with the same personality, with the same shortcomings, the same talents, let's say. The shortcomings are an important thing, same shortcomings, we don't become a saint. And yet, something radically different is there, but what's different is just the absence of suffering.
Work cut out for me.
Well, you see, even that, be careful. She has her work cut out for her. meaning some work to do to get to that place. But actually, even that's this belief that I'm going to do it. I've got to work hard, instead of a complete relaxation, where we realize, life has always been happening, that I, as the human being, am always going to function exactly the way I'm designed to function at that moment, meaning suffering will arise exactly as it's destined to arise based on my conditioning, and I have never done anything. No one in the entire history of the world has ever done a single thing. Now what that means is, clearly lots of things are happening. People open the fridge and they cook dinner and they say, well, I did that. And yes, of course, on a physical level it happened. The egg started in a shell and it ended up as an omelette on a plate. So something happened. What the notion of doership is pointing at, and non-doership, is the attitudinal belief that is superimposed on all of the actions that are happening in order to get the egg from being an uncooked egg to an omelette on the plate. It's the attitude or belief about how that is happening and who is doing it. The belief of doership is that, well, I obviously am the independent entity that makes everything happen and is in control of how good the egg is, or how it gets cooked and all that. And the attitude of non-doership is the realization that life has always been a happening, that the human being on a biological level is effectively programmed by life to do in each moment exactly what it does, and the outcome not in my control. And so when an omelette ends up on the table, it's in line with what I would have liked, let's say, if the objective was to cook an omelette. But that's just coincidental. It could well have turned out very differently. The phone could have rung, I could have forgot that I had the egg on the stove, and it could have burnt. And that wouldn't have been my doing, that would have been life unfolding as it was destined. And so if we toss a coin 10 times and we call heads, 5 times, let's say, out of 10, it's going to come up as heads. To think that because it came up as heads that I was in control for those 5 times is a mistake. So life is always going to turn out one way or another. And if we see that, in this instance it turned out the way I wanted, and we think that therefore I'm in control, it's an error. We have to see that I'm never in control. Sometimes it turns out the way I want, and sometimes it doesn't. And so, yes, if we start seeing the mechanical nature of life on one level, because remember, what the human being is at their core is far from mechanical. The peace doesn't stem from mechanics. The reason that life is being described as mechanics is simply so that the mechanical aspect of life, the objective aspect of life, can be seen as objective, can be seen as relative, can be seen as mechanical. And in doing that, the absolute aspect of life can get to recognize itself. For as long as the mechanical aspect of life or the relative aspect of life is seen to be as absolute when it's not, then the real absolute never gets to see itself, because there's an identification with the relative as absolute, which means attention is fully focused on something outside, and a realization of what we truly are tends not to happen. So, sometimes people, like yesterday, Trisha had a reaction to the concepts because they were interpreted as reducing life down to mechanics and impersonalness. And it's very understandable that is the reaction. And so I'm grateful for her bringing it up, because it allowed for an elaboration that says, let's look at some aspects of life as they really are, and looking at that and putting everything in its place can allow a revelation of another aspect of life that is completely not mechanical and not impersonal. So, yeah.
It seems like a big leap to be
I think it might be off.
It seems like a big leap to me from identifying as the doer to thinking that or knowing that all life is just happening. And what is if there's a pathway, what is it that you see, or what do you become aware of that takes you from one to the other?
It's a good question. In fact, it's such a good question that I'd like to, well, I could answer it now, but it's also lunchtime. So it would be great to go into the next session with that. Yeah? Okay. Thank you.